Hi, everybody. Welcome to another edition of Captain Lou's Champions of Sports History on this Tuesday, August the 20th, 2024. Hope everybody's having a great day, a great week, and a great summer. Hey, we thought we would take a little bit of a different theme here again as with a best of show here this week as we've talked about sports dynasties and some great teams in the world of football. And of course, let's turn our attention to probably our second favorite sport, and that, of course, is hockey. And we thought we would take a look back at a couple of dynasties that had their beginnings with some great teams. And that, of course, being the 1984 Edmonton Oilers in their run to the Stanley Cup final and championship, and the Detroit Red Wings finally breaking through after 42 years with their 1997 Stanley Cup championship run. Steve Lansky, a longtime producer for the Edmonton Oilers back in the day, he was there front and center. We had a chance to talk to him earlier this summer. We're going to bring you back that interview as he talked about that run to the Stanley Cup for the Edmonton Oilers. And Keith Gave, longtime Detroit Free Press reporter, covered the Red Wings for many years. He was right there as well, front and center, for the beginning of that Stanley Cup championship run for the Detroit Red Wings. And we'll play some of that interview as well. So we hope you enjoy this look at hockey as training camps, believe it or not, are about 2 weeks away from starting. Preseason games in September and then the NHL season starting up back in October. I know, where has the summer gone? So again, we invite you to sit back and watch two great interviews as we get ourselves ready for the upcoming hockey season. Captain Lou's Champions of Sports History live here on 12 Ounce Sports, Dingo TV, channel 217, and the Captain Lou Sports Network on YouTube. All right, right after this, we'll take a listen to Steve Lansky and our chat about the Edmonton Oilers. Don't go anywhere.
Need tickets to that next event? Well, at 12 Ounce Sports, we've got them with soccer anywhere in the world. Tickets to any venue, any sport. Want to go to NCAA or NFL football matches? We've got them. Baseball at every level. Every Power 5 matchup is available. Don't forget, costumes and paint are optional. What's that? You want to go to Broadway? We have those too. Want to jam out? Every concert, every artist. That's right, at 12 Ounce Sports, we've got the tickets for less. 12ozsports.com/tickets. That's 12ouncesports.com/tickets.
History of championship sports here on 12 Ounce Sports and the Captain Lou Sports Network, and season 1, episode 2, as we mentioned. And 1984 is our year this month, and we are pleased and excited to be joined by Steve Lansky. He was front and center for the Edmonton Oilers run in 1983 and 84, start of a mini dynasty. Steve, welcome to the program. How are you?
I'm great, Captain Lou. How are you?
I am doing wonderful. Before we get into, hard to believe that 84 season or the Stanley Cup has already been 40 years ago. It just seems like yesterday.
Where is that? Where is that? There we go. 4-0. Unbelievable.
Yeah, that we'll get into this in a minute, Steve, but just the style of hockey back then was incredible with all the output, the goal scoring and whatnot. It's something that I truly miss in the game of hockey.
I would lie if I say I didn't miss it too. There wasn't a ton of defense. The goaltending wasn't great, although there were great goaltenders, and we're going to talk about them today, but it just wasn't the caliber that it is now. And players were just kind of learning to be explosive and break out. I mean, Wayne Gretzky kind of started that. Marcel Dion, Mike Bossy, Brian Trottier, they were kind of at their peak at that time. And man, it was fun to watch, wasn't it?
Boy, it sure was. And I show tapes to my son and some of the younger people from the generation that never got to see it live, and they can't believe how explosive it was. You talked about Gretzky. They and the Edmonton Oilers came over from the WHA, and they made their mark in a hurry. And, the season before, the 82-83 season, they came into their own, really waltzed through the playoffs right up until the Stanley Cup final, and taking on that New York Islanders team that just, Steve, wasn't ready to give up the crown as the kings of the NHL.
Hey, listen, if you've won 3 in a row, you pretty much want to win 4 in a row.
Yeah.
And, the Oilers got spanked in 82 in the playoffs by the LA Kings when they lost that miracle on Manchester.
Yeah.
It kind of chokes me to even say that. And then they should not have gone out in the first round. And I think they had something to prove in 83. I don't have it in front of me. I think they only lost 1 game before the Stanley Cup final that year.
Yeah.
And they just met the Islanders, and they just flat out were not ready. I mean, you're talking about, kids in grade 11 playing against kids in grade 3. Like, they can be great grade 3 players, but they are not going to be great. And the Islanders were in grade 11 or maybe even in university. They schooled the Oilers from top to bottom in that series.
It's funny is I kind of relate it to some of the other teams that achieved greatness in both the NHL, maybe even the NBA a little bit. It's almost like you got to pay your comeuppance or pay your penance. Like, for example, the Red Wings in the 90s and, the Pistons in the late 80s. You got to the championship round, but you didn't know what it was like, and you learned from the Masters. And I think Edmonton, in my opinion, really learned a lot of valuable lessons in that 82-83 Stanley Cup final.
Captain Lou, if I say to you something 1,000 times, I explain it to you 1,000 times, or you can do it once, which one are you going to learn more from? You're going to learn from doing it that one time.
Yeah.
So when you get to the finals, there's no way to tell these players what it's like. And you get there and you go, oh, now I get it.
Yeah.
And that, there's that famous story of the Oilers walking by the Islanders' room, and the Islanders are all battered and bruised after 83. I don't know whether it's true or not. I don't know whether it's been embellished over the years. But if I saw a bunch of guys beat up after winning the Stanley Cup, I might scratch my head and go, maybe that's a component that we haven't figured out yet.
Yeah, exactly. And obviously they learned from it. And you could tell later on in the year, well, actually with the start that they got, but heading into the 83-84 season, one of the most interesting things for everybody in the league that year, Steve, was the advent of the 5-minute overtime. And, you look at their record, 57-18-5 that year, 119 points, but it was a lot different than what it is now. For the traditionalists back then, a tie was a tie. You played 60 minutes and that was it. Compared to now, I don't mind that 5-minute overtime scenario because you didn't get a point if you lost or even went into the extra session. And that 119 points to me looks a lot better than 119 points does now.
That's a great point. They didn't play a team in the playoffs that year in 84 that finished even close to them in points. The Islanders were the closest, and I think they were maybe 15 points behind. Yeah. But the North Stars and the Flames and the Jets, the Oilers were light years ahead of those guys going into that Stanley Cup playoffs. And they didn't lack any component. That's the thing that I keep looking back to. I know the 84-85 Oilers were voted the best team in Stanley Cup playoff or NHL history. But to me, that 83-84 team missed nothing. There was no component they didn't have.
We could talk about all the accolades that Wayne Gretzky had with, his 200 points again, which I don't know if that's ever going to be topped right now. Just the style of play is different. And I'm not taking anything away from the superstars now with Connor McDavid, Draisaitl, Auston Matthews, whatever. But that was just one of many accolades and standards that were set by Wayne Gretzky. His records are so numerous.
I don't have it in front of me, but I think that's the year he had his 51-game point streak. I'm not positive, but I think it was. Yeah, and I probably saw Wayne play about 600 times in person. Wow. In his career. That includes some WHA games, tons of road games, because I worked for Hockey Night in Canada for about a decade. So I saw Wayne play all over the place. I have never and will never see a player like Wayne Gretzky as long as I live. And I feel so blessed that I got to see him play that many times. He did stuff that I've never seen before or since. He thought stuff on the ice I've never seen before or since. It was scary, man. It was just, I don't know any other way to say it. It was just scary.
And they scored 446 goals that year. You think about that for a second. You divide that by 82 or 80 back then in the regular season. That's 5 goals a game. Yeah. That's just those stats are mind-boggling.
It's to me, when I hear that, I think, how did they ever lose a game?
How did they ever?
But you know what? Some teams shut them down every once in a while. I know Wayne's record point streak was stopped by the LA Kings, who had no business stopping it, but they did. But the Oilers would have games, and I mean, I produced a bunch of games, and I was at games. They'd win 9-2, 8-1. They won a playoff game in 1987. 13-2, I think it was. So when you're racking up those goals, I'll be honest, I don't know how opponents went in there and thought, we just want to get out alive. But some teams would go in and do it.
And you look at the season that they had, obviously they took the lesson that we talked about a few minutes ago, Steve, about losing in the Stanley Cup final. They started off, they rattled off 7 straight wins. And boy, they didn't look back. I think, what did they win? 39 out of their first 53 games or something. Is incredible.
That sounds about right. I'll buy that. You just never thought they were going to lose. I just remember thinking, they're never going to lose this game or that game or whichever game they're playing in. They always seem to have so many ways to win. Let's say Wayne wasn't going. Well, Jari Kurri is going, or Glenn Anderson was going. Mark Messier was going. Willie Lindstrom was going. And I haven't even said Paul Coffey yet, who I think he's the best offensive defenseman and the most beautiful skater I have ever seen in my life. And that's just a few components we're throwing out there.
It's funny is I was blessed to be able to watch Nicholas Lindstrom here in Detroit all those years. And I have to say, no, obviously I didn't see Bobby Orr. That was a little before my time. But I got to tell you, I'm right there with you. Paul Coffey in his prime, I don't think there's anybody better. Just the way he handled himself on the ice was something else.
So smooth.
Yeah.
And not only that, you got to remember when he started, oh man, people were all over him. Lots of mistakes, not getting his assignments, giving, terrible plus minus. And Glenn Sather stuck with him. I'm amazed we haven't talked about Glenn Sather till now. Glenn Sather stuck with him and said, look, Koff. And they didn't get along great, as you know, and he ended up getting traded to Pittsburgh.
Yeah.
But Glenn said, look, Koff, you just do the offensive thing and we'll figure out a way. We'll put Charlie Huddy with you. We'll figure out ways for this to succeed. And man, when he let him off the string, look out.
40 goals, 86 assists that year for a defenseman. That's insane.
It's unbelievable. And what was amazing to me when I think about it is you'd watch a play develop and you'd think, oh, who's going to score on this play? And then all of a sudden the puck went to Paul Coffey, wherever he was coming from, and he would just appear and boom, in the net. It was uncanny, that guy.
Oh, and I look up and down the roster, and I've been looking at this, and one name that stood out to me, he's a retired policeman here in the Michigan area, was Pat Hughes. Hit 27 goals, and I mean, you don't think of a guy like that. I mean, a guy like that right now would be making $6-7 million a year.
I don't know if that was the year, but one year Pat Hughes had a 5-goal game in Calgary. and I think it was the year before because he had it in the Stampede Corral, and 83-84 was the Flames' first year in the Saddle Dome. But Pat Hughes had 5 goals in one game, and see if you can guess who he was playing with that game. Right. Wayne Gretzky could set up you and me for a hat trick on any night he chose. And I can't skate. I don't know about you, but just anybody could do it. But I think if you're Pat Hughes, it would kind of become infectious. These guys are all doing this. I want to be part of the fun. And you know what? He did it too.
I got to ask you, and I'm sure I'll have to ask you this at the end of the broadcast. When you're watching greatness like this, did you ever just kind of take a step back and just think, wow, I mean, you know what I mean? It's just like you don't want to take it for granted how good this team was, how deep and everything.
So when I was producing an Oilers game on Hockey Night in Canada or on ITV in Edmonton, we really didn't have the luxury to soak it all in.
Okay.
Sometimes there'd be a great play and I'd give it a wow before. Let's cue that up on blue. Let's send it all the way back to the Oilers zone so we can see that 6-way passing play all the way into the net. When I wasn't working and I was just sitting in the press box and watching a game, that's when you really appreciated just how stupid talented these guys were. But when you're working, you kind of have to separate it, and you can't really enjoy it as much as you can. And then you watch the highlights later and you go, hey, we did a pretty good job televising that Picasso that the Oilers just painted.
I love that. That's a great word for it, for the whole season of Picasso. Steve Lansky's joining us here on Captain Lou's Championship Years in Sports History, highlighting 1984 this month, and of course to look at one of the most dominant teams in NHL history, that being the Edmonton Oilers. The season it's kind of a strange season, Steve. They had some big winning streaks, but they also had some crazy losing streaks too. Now, I understand the one they had where both Gretzky and Curry were injured, and they won the first game. I think it was if I can look it up real quick here. I was going to try to do it on memory. They won against Calgary, but then they lost 5 in a row, including an 11-0 loss to the Hartford Whalers. Who could imagine a team that good would drop an 11-0 game to the Hartford Whalers?
It's funny, that game wasn't on TV. Back in the day, not every game was on TV. Maybe 40. If you lived in Edmonton, maybe you could watch 40 games.
Okay.
The rest of the games you couldn't. That game was not on TV. And that was one of the biggest stink jobs of all time. That, in fact, it might be the worst that the Oilers have ever tossed. And sometimes you just need it to get your head back where it belongs. And the beauty of that was they'd been to the Stanley Cup final in 1983. And I don't want to diminish the regular season, but once you've been there, you realize that those 80 or 82 or 84 regular season games, they mean something, but not everything. And I think Glenn Sather and Teddy Green and John Muckler, the 3 coaches that year, were great at saying, hey, guys, just take that, crumple it up. We'll throw that over there. Because you know what? In April, it ain't going to matter. And it did not.
You mentioned Glenn Sather, and we have only talked about him a couple of times, but, what a mastermind. And I'll say this because he had such talent. It's like any other sport. You only have so many pucks on the ice, and keeping all of those those freewheeling, high scoring guys happy. And I know winning cures a lot of evil, Steve, but boy, oh boy, he did a good job of massaging a lot of egos and really keeping that dynasty going past 84 for that matter.
So I met Glenn Sather when I was in high school, and he became our neighbor on our street. And I ended up being the first statistician for the Edmonton Oilers when they went into the NHL. Wow. Glenn and I knew each other really well. We played pickup basketball in my driveway. We'd go over to the neighbors. Glenn needed his truck washed, so we'd play a little 2-on-2 versus the neighbors. We won every time because it's Glenn Sather and he ain't going to lose. Glenn got his Ford Bronco nice and clean all the time. I have never met anybody like Glenn Sather who could understand people's personalities and what people needed and didn't need, and whether they needed massaging, whether they needed to be left alone, whether they needed their tires pumped, whether they needed a little, slam dunk every once in a while. Glenn understood that like nobody I've met before or since. He understood personalities and people. Good coach, but unbelievable with personalities and people.
I look at this one stretch that they had where they won 13 out of 14 games. It was right, I want to say right like from the 35th game to the 50th game or something around there. And in that time, you talked about how maybe the goaltending wasn't the greatest back then, but what a mixture of games. I look at this like a 2-0 shutout they had. Then they played the North Stars one night and won 12-8. That must have been one heck of a game to produce there, Steve. 20 goals.
I didn't do the 12-8 game. I'm pretty sure Paul Coffey got 8 points in that game. I'm not positive, but that's what I remember. But the thing about them was they kind of realized they could win any way they had to win. If they were only going to get 2 goals, Grant Fuhr and Andy Moog, who were arguably the best tandem in the history of the National Hockey League. I'm sure there were better tandems if I really sat down and crunched my brain. But if you said to me, best tandem, I'm taking them right off the top. Because if it wasn't Fuhr, it was Moger. If it wasn't Moog, it was Fierzy. They could Glenn could interchange them any way he wanted. So we're talking about Coffey and Curry and Lindstrom and Gretzky and Messier and Anderson. How about Fuhr and Moog? Like, there was no weak link.
And they were young. They were what, 25 and 24 or 23?
I think Grant Fuhr was 22 the year they won the Stanley Cup.
Isn't that something? I mean, I'm probably getting the years mixed up. In the Stanley Cup final, he got injured and Andy Moog took his place. Is that correct?
Yeah, in 1984, that's right.
It was. Okay.
Yeah, so Fierzy didn't do a great job against LA in 82. 83, they go all the way to the Stanley Cup final. Andy Moog's the guy. But then in 84, Slats has who can do this? Slats gets to come back with Grant Fuhr, and Grant Fuhr goes all the way. He got hurt in the Minnesota series. He missed 1 game, and then he got plowed into the boards by Pat Hughes, who we talked about, and Pat LaFontaine. Yeah. And Fuhr got hurt, and then he didn't finish that Stanley Cup final. Moog was in net.
And it's funny is I remember watching that, and I remember seeing that happen. And I thought, boy, and I just wondered to myself if that was going to make a difference in that. Well, we'll talk about that a little bit later on. Obviously, it didn't. But you talk about it, the depth in those 2 goalies. And, with Andy Moog, I was jealous as a Red Wings fan, especially, in 84. It was like 2 years prior, Detroit would have to give away a car just to get people into Joe Louis Arena to watch a hockey game. It's so different how it was back then.
It was very different, and Glenn had just everything at his disposal. But like you said, you can have the whole chessboard with all the pieces. You still got to know where to move the pieces to win the game. And nobody did that like Glenn.
So how did he keep the focus, though? It's funny. It's on our last show, we talked about the Detroit Tigers that year. They started out 35-5. And I asked him, I said, how did Sparky keep the focus with the guys? It's so easy to take the foot off the gas. How was Glenn able to keep them motivated to keep such a big lead towards the end of the regular season?
Well, when you talk about Sparky Anderson with the Reds and the Tigers, you're talking about literally one of the greatest managers of all time. For me, he's right there with Earl Weaver and Billy Martin. Mm-hmm. Glenn was very smart. Glenn basically said to the guys, look, do whatever you want. Don't embarrass the team. And I'm talking about on and off the ice. You go wild offensively, because Glenn did some stuff in the WHA. And he saw Bobby Hull, and he saw Anders Hedberg, and he saw Ulf Nilsson, and he saw Kent Nilsson with the Winnipeg Jets. And he watched how they were just allowed to go crazy offensively and make up for a lot of defensive issues that those Jets might have had. Well, I was at enough Oilers practice to watch. He just basically threw pucks out there and said, guys, I just want you to skate your brains out. Have fun. Practice would end. Slats would go back into the room. Gretzky'd be out there. Messier'd be out there. There's that much snow on the ice, and they're still practicing until they finally say, okay, guys, we gotta end this. But the beauty of it is, we haven't talked about this. Those Oilers grew up together, and there is no substitute for that. Am I right? You're in school, let's say. These guys that you form bonds with in school, sometimes you're friends with them for the rest of your life. Well, this was basically school that the Oilers, because it's 22, 21, 23, 24 years old. They're just growing up. They're just going into the league. And Glenn said, hey, guys, we're a team. And he didn't use the word family, but we're going to grow together. Made all the difference in the world, in my opinion.
Was there a player or two, Steve, that you were surprised that was as good as they were on that team that year? Does that make sense?
It does. Willie Lindstrom did a good job. Willie was a little bit older. He played in the WHA with the Winnipeg Jets, and the Oilers brought him in. He scored a few points in the Stanley Cup playoffs that I thought, I didn't see Lindstrom doing that. They brought in Yaroslav Pozar, an older Czech player, and he played a bunch of games. But I think all of it, Captain Lou, factors into the components of Glenn knew where to put this guy here, or this guy here, or this guy would slide in for a game. Pat Conacher played a couple of games, got a key goal in the Stanley Cup final. Yeah, who knows how, yeah, right? Who knows how to slot all those guys? So they all surprised me, but they were only given the chance to surprise because Glenn knew which piece to put in which part of the puzzle.
You know, and you had Kenny Linsman, 18 goals that year too. I mean, there's somebody we haven't mentioned. It. We could talk for 2 hours just on all the different guys we haven't mentioned that had, 60 points or 50 points on that team. It's just mind-boggling.
And think about it. Who thinks Kenny Linsman is going to be a good fit there? Except here's Glenn. 1980, double overtime. Yeah. Oilers lose to the Flyers in 3 games. But he hated Kenny Linsman's guts so much. That only means one thing, doesn't it? Oh, yeah. We need him. And he brings him in. And, Linsman scored the Stanley Cup winning goal for the Oilers that year. I wouldn't have said he fit in that dynamic. But Glenn knew exactly what to say to him. You're going to do this, but you're not going to do these things. You're not going to take stupid penalties. You're just going to go out there and basically piss people off for 60 minutes. Perfection.
Boy. Okay, now we get to the playoffs, and, they dispatched of Winnipeg rather easily, 9-2. I know the second game, I think, was an overtime game. Then the third game, 4-1, back when it was, I think, 3 out of 5. And then Calgary, we all know the rivalry that Edmonton has with Calgary, and that went 7. Were you surprised that it went 7 games?
That's a good question. I was at every game in that series. Before that series, a couple of Oilers said they didn't really think there was that big a rivalry between the teams. Now, to me, if I was Calgary, that would have ticked me off.
Oh, sure.
But Badger Bob Johnson only wanted to do one thing. He wanted to win the Stanley Cup.
Yeah.
But honest to God, I think that was 1B. He wanted his Flames to beat the Oilers so bad. And when that series started, the Flames came out and really, they wanted to win, but they really wanted to hit the Oilers. They wanted to make the Oilers pay for every inch of ice that they got. So the Oilers went up 3-1 in that series. Flames came back and made it 3-3.
Yeah.
Kerry Wilson, rookie, scored an overtime goal for the Flames in Game 2. And I'll be honest, the Oilers changed goalies in Game 7. And they still won the series. But that series was as close as it was going to get. And Paul Coffey after said, they scared the crap out of us. And maybe that's what the Oilers needed.
That could have been. How was the atmosphere for that Game 7 in Edmonton? That had to have been something.
The atmosphere was nuts for every game. Absolutely every game. And Game 6 was the game that went to overtime.
Yeah.
And Lanny McDonald scored that goal that I still think Fuhr should have had from the left side half boards.
Yeah.
But I just remember the place going nuts. And it was just so intense. Now, it was less intense than 1986. That was the series that, I can't believe I'm going to say it, Steve Smith scored in his own net.
Oh,
but yeah, that series was the greatest series I've ever seen in my entire life. Again, I was at every game. That was nuts. But 84 was the year the Flames figured out, and if they'd have had goaltending, they had Reggie Lemelin and Don Edwards, who weren't great. In 86, they had Mike Vernon, who was going to win a Conn Smythe Trophy for your Red Wings.
Yep.
Yeah. In 86, they beat the Oilers. But in 84, man, if they'd have had a couple of breaks, they'd have beaten them. And I think they scared the Oilers, and the Oilers knew it.
Oh, definitely. And anybody that says it didn't, I think, they might be telling a little bit of a lie. So for those that don't know, the way the format was back then was the top 4 teams in each division played each other in the opening 2 rounds of the playoffs. And Steve, I can say this now, but I look, we being Norris division fans here in Michigan with the Red Wings and back then the Maple Leafs and the North Stars and the Blackhawks, it was like the minor leagues. It was like the IHL at the time playing the NHL. You could tell. And then when you guys took on the North Stars, it was like men playing against boys.
It's too too bad. But and I don't want to say Minnesota had no chance, but they had no chance. They had 88 points. The Oilers had 119. And I think what you said, Captain Lou, makes sense. You built your team to win your division. So the Oilers, they wanted to just beat Calgary and Winnipeg. And then whoever they played in the Norris in the Campbell Conference Championship Series, that was okay. But the Jets tried to beat the Oilers. The Flames tried to beat the Oilers. The Oilers tried to beat everybody in the Smythe. The Norris was more of a muckers division, right? Oh. You had the Blues in there too. You had Broby, you had Joey Koser. Like it was.
Many thanks to Steve Lansky for taking time out back in the summer, early part of the summer, or maybe it was late spring. Anyways, it was back in the Stanley Cup final run for this year's Edmonton Oilers, talking about that great Edmonton Oilers team from 1984 that went on to win 4 Stanley Cups. Again, great names: Gretzky, Curry, Messier, Grant Fuhr, just to name a few. So many Hall of Famers on that team. But you talk about Hall of Famers in the world of professional hockey. Well, 1997 was the year the Detroit Red Wings finally broke through with their first Stanley Cup since 1955. And we had a chance to talk to Keith Gabe, longtime Detroit Free Press reporter. He was right there for that run. Let's take a listen.
Welcome back, everybody, to Captain Lou's championship years in sports history, as we now turn our focus to the year 1997. And we thought it'd be great to spotlight the Detroit Red Wings and look at their run to their first Stanley Cup championship since 1955. And we thought we would bring in the author of the book, The Russian Five. And he was a longtime reporter for the Detroit Free Press. And Keith Gabe joining us. Keith, thanks for taking time out to be with us. How are you?
I'm well, thanks, Lou, and thanks for the invitation. It's always fun to talk about those years, I'm telling you.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun back then. It really sparked a lot of excitement in the Detroit area for a lot of long-suffering Red Wing fans like myself.
Well, there was a lot of pent-up anticipation for sure. Some serious disappointment in the years leading up to that 97 championship. I lived through them all. I'll tell you what, it's a lot more enjoyable to interview athletes after they've just won the Stanley Cup, as opposed to when they just, suffered a bitter first-round defeat and they're crying in the corner in the locker room.
Oh, boy. I can't imagine. You look back, they had some good teams, 94 when they lost to the Sharks, Chris Osgood, I can still see him after that game. And then, of course, 95 when they had the strike shortened year. We'll talk about that real quick.
Right.
They won the President's Cup trophy, which a lot of teams don't even want to get anymore once they get moving into the Stanley Cup playoffs. It seems it's almost like a jinx. But, I was stunned the way they got swept by New Jersey, as I think a lot of people were that year.
Everybody was, Lou. Everybody was. They crushed the 48-game regular season, right? They only played teams in the Western Conference. Detroit was in the West then, right?
Yeah.
And, then they get into the playoffs. They're 12-2, 12 wins, 2 losses going into the finals, which is why everybody on the planet was picking the Detroit Red Wings, not just to win the Stanley Cup, but to sweep.
Yeah.
Well, it was a sweep, all right, but the wrong way.
Yeah, there was maybe a little-known goaltender in the Detroit area. We didn't know a whole lot about him back then by the name of Martin Brodeur. And he wasn't little known after that series. Boy, he made Detroit look pretty tame in that series, didn't he?
Well, he was awfully good, no question about it. But I'll tell you what I saw in that series was kind of the blueprint for what we saw of the Detroit Red Wings a couple of years later. You look at that Jersey team, the defense that they had: Scott Stevens, Ken Danico, defensive defenseman, Scott Niedermeyer, and Brian Rafalski. I mean, 4 legit number 1 defensemen. and three of them are probably two of them are in the Hall of Fame, and the other two should be considered. And then they had that really, really good fourth line, Bobby Holik, and names good. Randy McKay was one of them. A tremendous fourth line, which was sort of a precursor. Scotty Bowman's idea when he put the grind line together a couple years later. It was patterned after that New Jersey team that had a really, really good shutdown fourth line. The guy missing is Mike Peluso, big tough guy on that Jersey fourth line. That was a really good line.
Well, it sure was, and so Detroit rebounded. Well, they got in 95, 96. I mean, they went on a tear. We all know the regular season they had set all kinds of records. They beat they didn't shatter it, but they beat Montreal's record for wins in the regular season, 130 some points. And again, it looked like they were headed for a potential return trip to the Stanley Cup Finals, but laying in the weeds for them was the Avalanche coming over from Quebec City, and they had a goaltender by the name of Patrick Waugh standing in their name amongst other people on that roster.
Well, you mentioned the right name there. He was the difference, of course. But what inspired that him winding up in Colorado in the first place, Lou, if you remember the game against Montreal where I think they beat the Canadiens 12-2 or something like that in Montreal, and a total embarrassment. They hung Patrick Waugh out to dry. He got in an argument with his coach when he finally was called in after 9 or 10 goals, and basically told the general manager first, and then the coach, "I'll never play for you again. I'm out of here." And they traded him to Colorado. And as soon as that deal was made, Scotty Bowman calls up his assistant coaches and says, "This is not good for us." Wow. And it turned out not to be.
You talk about that game, and I can always remember, I think Martin Trombley was the coach back then.
Yeah.
And he made it no secret that he disliked Scotty Bowman a ton. And every time I remember that, I remember him saying that, and I laugh every time I see it.
Yeah. It was one of those moments, in the arc of the Stanley Cup, the Detroit Stanley Cup experience in the 90s. That game stands out as maybe a big reason why the Wings don't have another Stanley Cup to their war chest.
And so he goes to Colorado, and it just, I thought Detroit was going to cruise into that series. Again, you heard a little bit about him, guys like Joe Sakic and whatnot, Keith, but boy, they ran into a buzzsaw. And of course, we all know what happened, to Draper and all of that with Lemieux. And, obviously it served as a little motivation, but boy, oh boy, the way they steamrolled through that regular season, it just, again, was a shocker. And what you said at the top of the interview here, Keith, I couldn't have envied you at all trying to talk to those players after losing that series.
Well, yeah, that was a tough one, I'll tell you. Because they weren't planning a Stanley Cup parade by any means. They knew that they were going to have their work cut out for them in Colorado. They thought they'd be able to compete a little bit better against them. Listen, that Colorado team was a very, very, very good team. Detroit and Colorado those years mirrored one another just about. And the other team out west that mirrored those two teams was Dallas. Yeah. Those three teams were dominant out west. Detroit won 97-98, Dallas won in 99, and Colorado's got a couple of Stanley Cups in there too. And the only real dominant team in the East was New Jersey, and they won a couple of cups in those years as well, that stretch of time from 95 on. But, listen, I still remember seeing Chris Draper when he returned from the hospital to join his team after being, getting some repairs on that face that he had rearranged by that vicious check by Claude Lemieux in the early in the game, first period, I think. It doesn't matter. Yeah. But he went down badly, and it shook the team up, shook the whole Red Wings team up to see their teammate take some abuse like that. And listen, Chris Draper has one of the most beautiful smiles in the history of the NHL. I mean, he's just always happy-go-lucky guy, always smiling, always in a good mood. And to see his face get rearranged like that, just shattered. The guy had his jaw wired for 6 weeks, taking every meal out of a straw, for God's sakes. That was motivation for what followed, of course, in 96, 97. But I still remember Dino Ciccarelli talking to us afterwards saying, I can't believe I shook his bleeping hand, right. I don't know why anybody shook Claude Lemieux's hand at the end of that game, to be honest. And I'll tell you what, to this day, we haven't gotten there yet, but what happened between him and Darren McCarty in, the following spring, that set up the 97 Stanley Cup championship, the brawl at Joe Louis Arena. Mm-hmm. To see Darren McCarty and Claude Lemieux getting together for these public whatever money raising events, it kind of makes me sick to see those two guys together. And I know that it does a lot of Darren McCarty's teammates. They don't like it either, to be honest with you.
Wow. I tend to agree with you. I'm shocked that they did it. I've had a chance to meet and talk to Darren McCarty a couple of times. And I'm surprised that he does it, but obviously like you said, they do it for the reasons they do it. But it kind of reminds me now of how some of the pro athletes are in other sports. They're all friends now.
Oh yeah. Well, you're right. They're all union brothers for one thing. There's a lot less hate in all the games, but to see the one league that was able to sustain that hate a little bit, especially come playoff time, was the NHL.
Yeah.
But it's waning. You don't see much of that stuff anymore at all. And frankly, I think it makes for a much less interesting game.
Boy, I can't argue with you there, Keith. And you talk about Ciccarelli shaking his hand. I mean, that has got to be, I love the tradition. I love it. But that has got to be one of the toughest things to do after you beat the crap out of each other for 5, 6, 7 games. They're hating on each other right now. And so I will give players credit for doing that, but they only do it because they have to.
Pretty much. There are some special moments in that handshake line for sure. Former teammates coming together and so on. It's one of the great traditions. I hope it never ends. Yeah. But I'd like to see a little bit more truculence in the game these days, as Brian Burke would say, right?
Exactly. I love it. Well, Keith, so Colorado went on to just, in my opinion, annihilate Florida in that finals. I mean, I know
4-game sweep. Yeah.
Yeah. I know they won the final game in triple overtime, but even if they would have lost that game, I think they would have won it in a gentleman's sweep in 5 games easy.
Of course. Yeah, I think so too. Yes. And, it's really, it really would have been cool if Detroit could have won and advanced to play Florida in the finals, because Florida was being run by Brian Murray and Doug McClain, who'd left Detroit. When Mike Ilitch fired Brian Murray and Doug McClain went along with him, they wound up in Florida, built a pretty good team down there, and who was an assistant coach in Detroit with Brian, and he was elevated to assistant general manager. Yeah. He was the coach down in Florida when they went. It would have been really cool to see Detroit play Florida that year, but it didn't happen.
Well, after the season, going into 97 or 96, 97, Keith, how much pressure was on Scotty Bowman going into that year?
I think there was a fair amount. He was convinced that his team wasn't ready yet, wasn't built yet for what they had to do. And it was pretty clear in that series against Colorado that they had to be better. They had to get better. And, Scotty pushed really hard to make that trade for Brendan Shanahan, which a lot of people think was the last piece of the puzzle. And I've said that myself, but when I think about it, he was an important piece of the puzzle to be sure. But he made a couple of more trades. He picked up Hall of Fame defenseman Larry Murphy, who was being booed off the ice every shift in Toronto, came to Detroit, and continued his Hall of Fame career. And then he made another trade, a really good young centerman that I liked a lot, Greg Johnson. He traded him away for Thomas Sandstrom. You got bigger and stronger on the wing there and so on. And finally had a team that could win a Stanley Cup. And my God, by then, not only did you have a whole bunch of Hall of Famers, the Russian Five, and Yzerman, Shanahan, Lidstrom, and so on, Thomas Holmstrom, but you had the grind line, which played a huge role in that season and several more seasons to come.
What when they made that trade with Shanahan, they got rid of Coffey and Keith Primo. What was the reaction in the locker room when they made that trade?
Loved it. The players loved it because they had a Hall of Fame winger in Brendan Shanahan.
Okay.
Keith Primo was a serviceable number 3 center, I guess.
Okay.
And he was still young in his career, still developing, really. And he went on to have a very, very good career. He was captain of the Philadelphia Flyers for some time. Mm-hmm. And Paul Coffey was near the end of his career. He was traded to Hartford in that deal, and Hartford traded him at the deadline to Philadelphia, and he played against Detroit in the Stanley Cup Finals.
That's right.
And he didn't play very well, actually, but there was the players were thrilled to get a big, tough, strong, premier power forward in the NHL that Brendan Shanahan was at age 27 when they brought him in.
Yeah. They traded Cicerelli in the off season before that, if I'm not mistaken, for a draft pick, correct?
Yes. Well, Scotty had a way of shedding players who had loose lips. All my great sources in that dressing room he traded away. Ray Shepard for Igor Larionov. Sean Burr, I love Sean. I miss him to this day. And of course, we were just talking about Cicerelli. They all talked a fair amount. The one guy who said what he wanted to say all the time, and Scotty couldn't do anything about it. One of my best sources in that room was Mike Vernon, the goaltender. Mike said whatever was on his mind, and Scotty had to deal with it because that was a goaltender who's going to win him a Stanley Cup.
Boy, I want to go back to what you said about getting Larry Murphy. I can remember when they got him at the deadline, and I had a couple of buddies of mine that were diehard Maple Leafs fans back then, and they couldn't believe that they traded him to Detroit for a song.
Right.
And what a huge pickup. Boy, oh boy, I agree with you. That I think was the final missing piece right there.
Oh, it was. Now, here's the thing. We just talked about New Jersey and the defense that they had, right? I mean, 2 Hall of Famers and 2 guys who, have pretty darn good credentials. You look at Detroit's defense now with Larry Murphy added. You got Nick Lidstrom and Larry Murphy, 2 Hall of Famers, right? Yeah. You got Slava Tisov, Hall of Famer. Vladimir Konstantinov, who would have been in the Hall of Fame had he finished his career. Would be in the Hall of Fame. 4 guys in the Hall of Fame on defense. That's how you win Stanley Cups.
Oh, absolutely. And, what did they ended up with 8 Hall of Famers on that roster, correct?
I think that's about right. And a few years later, they had even more.
Yeah.
In 2002, that team was loaded as well. That's when you can just write a check and get a player, right? You can't do that so much anymore.
No, that's funny. I just want to touch on that real quick. We talk about how, they had Sergei Fedorov and, the accolades and the comparisons that he got, that he was right up there with Mario Lemieux and Wayne Gretzky, and I remember he turned down in 2003, I think it was $50 million over 5 years. And
that's correct.
I mean, that's big money right now, 20 years later. I couldn't believe it.
That's correct. And that's why you'll never see his name, his jersey in the rafters at Little Caesars Arena because of that. And keep in mind, that was the second time that he signed with somebody else.
Yeah.
Or that he left the team. In 1998, right after the Olympics, he signed a contract with CompuWare, with not CompuWare owner Pete Carmanos, who owned Carolina at the time. $38 million for 5 years. And but most of it was front loaded in bonuses.
Yeah.
It was really $2 million a year for 5 years and $28 million in bonuses, which had to be paid. If the Detroit Red Wings won the Stanley Cup again, they would owe Sergei Fedorov $28 million.
Wow.
$28 million in a matter of about 5 months. Marian Ilitch was so angry that, I mean, like she said, they had 5 days to match. They had 5 days to match that deal. And they said, well, what are we going to do? Let them go. We'll take the draft picks or whatever. We're not paying that kind of money. We might be well off, but it's all on paper. We don't have $28 million sitting in the bank that we can just write them a check, right? Marion took Jimmy D along with them. Jim Devellano, the general manager at the time, senior vice president, and basically said, went to the top of Comerica Bank to see the president of the bank, and Marion laid it out for him. Said, we need $28 million in a very short time. If we win the Stanley Cup, we're going to owe this guy this much money. And the banker says, no problem. Whatever you need, we'll take care of it. Don't worry about it. And she basically said, amortize it over 5 years. If we win the Stanley Cup, we're gonna pay it off early, which they did. But here's the thing: when you win a Stanley Cup in those years, you win a Stanley Cup, owners can expect to make $22, $24, $25 million, right? That's their profit when you have all those people in the stands for a whole bunch, 4 rounds of playoff hockey, right?
Yeah.
The Wings Mike and Marian Ilitch didn't make a dime that spring when they won that Stanley Cup because they had to pay Sergei Fedorov all that money. And that's one time that he betrayed them essentially. And then a few years later, they're trying to sign him again. Jimmy D's talking with 2 different agents. He can't figure out who to talk to, who to get this deal done to sign Sergei to make him a Red Wing for life, which is what they certainly intended. Mike Ilitch got frustrated and said, we're going to have a meeting. Jimmy D, Ken Holland, bring in Sergei. The 4 of us are going to talk this over. So they got Sergei in that meeting, the 4 of them, and Mike said, Sergei, we're to make this easy. We're going to give you $10 million a year for 5 years, $50 million. Sign the contract. You're going to be a Red Wing for life. And he said, well, Sergei essentially said, thank you, Mr. Ilitch. I'll think about it and get back to you. And he shook their hands and he left. Wow. And when he walked out, Mike Ilitch looks at the other 2 guys and said, that's it. He's gone. And Jimmy D said, what do you mean, Mike? He said he's going to think about it. He said, no. He said, when you get an offer like that, you shouldn't have to think about it. And of course, a few days later, he signed with Anaheim. Brian Murray's out in Anaheim at the time. 4 years, $40 million to leave Detroit and go play in Anaheim. He left $10 million on the table to leave Detroit. You think Marian Ilitch, as long as she's breathing, is ever going to see Sergei Fedorov's number at the top of the building at Little Caesars? Never. Never. And I can't blame her.
No, 100%.
I can't blame her.
100%. Unbelievable. We're joined by Keith Gave, longtime Detroit Free Press hockey reporter, of course, and has spent some time with the Dallas Morning News, covered the Red Wings back in '97, of course, author of the Russian 5, gracious with his time. Keith, you talked about a little bit earlier in that regular season, 96-97, you talked about how good Dallas was. They won the division that year. Detroit was second. You had Colorado. And then, of course, over in the other conference, you had Philadelphia and the Rangers. There was some loaded teams that, and there was almost, Detroit won the President's Cup the last 2 years. And, back then as a fan base, we were, we were nervous but excited, and they started out decent. But, again, in the regular season, if I'm not mistaken, they had losing records against everybody in their division except Toronto, who was in last place.
Yeah, and I've talked to the players about that a lot. Brendan Shanahan is especially forthcoming about the team's attitude that season. I mean, they realized what they did the year before that 131 point season, 62 wins.
Mhm.
They expended a lot of energy to set those records. I mean, it was important to them. That's human nature. When you have something like that in sight, to beat Scotty Bowman's Montreal teams, for goodness sakes, with more points, more wins in a season. They worked really hard to get those records, right?
Yeah.
And they lost to Colorado in the semifinals. And they basically, as a group, they said, you know what? We're not going to bust our asses in the regular season. We know what it takes now. We're going to pace ourselves, and we know what it takes in the playoffs. We're going to get to the playoffs and have a little bit of energy left to play 4 rounds of playoff hockey, which is what they did. I mean, if you look at the way they finished the season, I don't know off the top of my head, they lost 5 of the last 7 games or something like that. They didn't finish very well at all. But when teams are often accused of flipping a switch, you can flip the switch or not. There's a debate about whether that that can happen or not. Well, the Red Wings in those days could do that. They were that good, and they knew it could come playoff time. Okay, new season, clean slate, let's go, and they did. And it was what they did in the Stanley Cup Finals that season, that spring, and to get to Philadelphia, that big, scary Legion of Doom line, and that team. Everybody's picking, Philadelphia to do the same thing that New Jersey did 2 years earlier, and didn't quite work out for them, did it?
Was that the series, Keith, or was it Carolina that Shanahan said they skated by him in the opening game, and they knew that they had him beat right from the get-go?
That was Philadelphia.
Okay,
yeah, they were harder. They were heavier, harder, faster. Yeah. I mean, you look at the opening shift of that first game in Philadelphia. Who does Scotty have on the ice taking the opening faceoff? Who's it? You got world-class centermen like Steve Yzerman and Sergei Fedorov, Igor Larionov, right? Who's taking the opening faceoff? Chris Draper against Eric Lindros with Darren McCarty and Kirk Maltby, the grind line against the Legion of Doom. And they outplayed them. They outhit them. They outskated them. And they scored an early goal, and the rest was history. I mean, Philadelphia had no idea what hit them.
No.
They were out of it from the middle of the first period onward. They were done. You can see it.
Oh, I can remember that line always sticks with me. What Shanahan said, they were skating around in the opening one.
And of course, that Keith gave talking about the 1997 Detroit Red Wings on their way to their first Stanley Cup, the first of 4 for them, 97 and 98 back to back. And then we talked briefly about the 2002 team, which, my goodness, I think they had at least 10 Hall of Famers on that, and maybe a couple of more. And then, of course, the 2008 team that went to the Stanley Cup Finals and won. 2009 got to the finals, couldn't complete the back-to-back against the Pittsburgh Penguins. But a great look back at some great professional hockey teams in the NHL, obviously, with the 1984 Edmonton Oilers and the 1997 Detroit Red Wings. So we hope you enjoyed a look back at those 2 great teams, definitely champions in sports history, the Edmonton Oilers and the Detroit Red Wings. Well, hey, that's going to do it for another edition of Captain Lou's Champions of Sports History, brought to you as always here on 12 Ounce Sports by tickets.12ounce sports. We are a ticket broker. We are your place to go for all the best in tickets. The NHL season coming up just around the corner in about a month and a half. We are your place to go for all of those tickets. NHL, college hockey, college football, NFL, anywhere. That's tickets.12ouncesports.com. All right. Thanks to Steve Lansky again, talking about the Edmonton Oilers, and Keith Gabe of the Detroit Free Press, talking about the Detroit Red Wings. Until next time, Captain Lou saying, keep your heads up, keep your sticks down, keep your feet moving, and as always, keep your minds open. So long, everybody. Have a great day.